Hello and welcome to the Forum for Philosophy. My name is Danielle Sands and I'm a fellow at the Forum, and I'm going to be chairing this evening's event in which we think about religious art. The relationship between religion and art is ancient and complex, varying across religious traditions and cultures. We'll consider how these traditions of religious art differ and what role art plays in religion today. How should we display religious art? Might it be a way of opening interfaith dialogue? Has art itself become a kind of religion? It's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers for this evening. Mehreen Chida-Razvi is an art historian specializing in the art and architecture of Mughal South Asia. She is deputy curator of the Nasser Khalili collection of Islamic art and assistant editor for the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. She's published extensively and teaches widely on Mughal art, architecture, and urbanism. Ben Quash is Professor of Christianity and the Arts at King's College London. His research interests include pneumatology, metaphysics and theological aesthetics, the role of the arts in stimulating theological engagement, modern philosophical and systematic theology, and Christian ethics. He's published extensively in all of these areas. Lieke Wijnia is an art historian and religious studies scholar. She works as a curator at the Museum Catharijneconvent in Utrecht, the National Museum for Christian Art and Heritage in the Netherlands. She's the author of Beyond the Return of Religion, Art in the Post-Secular, which was published by RHUL in 2018. So Ben, perhaps you can start things off. How should we understand the relationship between art and religion?
Well, it goes without saying that's an absolutely enormous question, but I'm glad I have other people around the table, virtual table, to help me try and answer that. Both art and religion are umbrella terms, and that creates both problems and opportunities in both cases, because the things that are gathered under those two umbrellas are so diverse. And so the category religion itself is a relatively modern category. And the traditions of practice and belief that are grouped under the heading of religion don't always converge around certain common things. I mean, there are often observable commonalities between them, but they often diverge very dramatically from each other, and there's a danger in conflating them. The same is true of the arts, because they take such a huge variety of forms in terms of medium, whether they're performative, permanent or temporary, static, plastic, and so on. So that's a kind of preamble to say we have to tread with great care through this territory for two reasons. And then the relationship between these two quite baggy categories is a sort of fraught space, or has been at various points in history. And one of the ways I like to explore this is through different words you might insert between the two to try and get at the ways they relate, the multiple ways they relate. So sometimes art is for religion. Religious traditions use art for particular purposes. It might channel devotion, art might be precisely the embodiment of a god, or a window onto a heavenly reality. It might be something you use in the context of worship. So that's art for religion. At other times, there's a sense in which art is used about religion. So, you know, religious practices and identities are explored with the help of art, and that's more of a kind of outsider perspective on religions that art has been played a part in. There's also a possibility that art might be art with religion, in the sense that it uses religious motifs and symbols, and this is certainly true in a lot of modern and contemporary art. It uses religious symbols and motifs to explore something that isn't necessarily religious. It's just that there's a kind of inherited language. The cross, for example, is, you know, or the Last Supper. The poster for this forum tonight was yet another meme of the Last Supper. Those have proliferated everywhere because it's become a motif borrowed from religion to talk about any number of other things. And then there's the idea that art might be instead of religion. And you hinted at that in saying that sometimes it's as if art has itself become something we revere, something that we gather around in order to explore the big questions of life, death, meaning, and so on. So all of these things are in play, and that would be my initial slightly wordy answer to your question.
Thanks,
Ben. Sorry, and then there's the question of just iconoclasm. So as it were, you can flip it and I think about art religion without art, as well as religion with art, because certain religious traditions, and Mehreen might well have things to say about this, are very, very sort of suspicious of the idea of visual art, certainly at all.
Thanks, Ben. Lieke or Mehreen, do you want to jump in at this stage and maybe give us some other ideas about what we want to be thinking about over the next hour or so?
Yeah,
Lieke, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Ben just said, with the sort of the cautionary warning in thinking about religious art or the relationship between art and religion, because both terms are so multifaceted. But I think exactly that word relate or relationship between them is what makes it so interesting, and what makes it sort of worth exploring. How does the relationship between art and religion take form, and yeah, which many forms can that take? And I was thinking about how to sort of make this question manageable, or the answer manageable, and I was thinking of terms that you can use to sort of explore that relationship. And I think one term or one concept that's prevalent in both art and religion is the notion of creation. And I think that's really important in, you know, both understanding art and religion, and also their interest in each other. You know, the artist creates out of materials, but materials that he or she has to sort of mold and shape in the or in response to imagination or ideas, interpretations that the artist has. And that, yeah, the sense of creation is of course extremely important in religion as well. And that's also an area in which, how do you say that? The two have tried to sort of come together. And a great example, I think, is the letter to artists of, was it Pope John Paul II, who wrote it in 1999, to sort of address artists and say, well, it may seem like art and institutional religion don't have a lot to tell each other anymore. We might have lost each other out of sight, but actually creation is essential in both our fields or both our domains. And we can actually sort of the mystery of creation, the flow, that which cannot be grasped, that's so essential to making art, but also to believing, to faith. In that area we can find each other again. And that was really sort of literally an invitation of artists, for artists to engage with religion more again. So I think that notion is really interesting in exploring the relationship between art and religion, but also, and that is a kind of a sort of a very positive approach. And I think the notion of boundaries is really interesting when it comes to the relationship between art and religion. There's always a sense of boundary, whether it's boundaries that are respected by artists working within a particular religious tradition, or whether these boundaries are completely broken, completely challenged, or maybe they are stretched a little, that the edges are soft, without meaning any disrespect. But there's always, I think there's always sort of, yeah, negotiation between what's possible, what's, are we doing any harm, or are we, are artists, by pushing the boundaries, are they actually also maybe reviving particular ideas or particular beliefs? So I think that it's a contested area. What is the boundary? When is it too much, and when is it still okay? But that's what makes the relationship so interesting, I think. And in thinking about boundaries, if you look at art history, if we look at older artworks that we really appreciate now, there are often artists in their times that crossed particular boundaries, and now they have become icons of art. So if we think about, I don't know, Caravaggio or Rembrandt or well, Artemisia Gentileschi, who now has that great exhibition in the National Gallery, you know, they were all shocking in their time, the stuff they made, and now they are magnificent icons, and they are exemplary. So I think over time, yeah, the notion of boundaries or how boundaries are perceived changes, and I think that's one of the yeah, really interesting things about the relationship between art and religion.
Thanks, Lieke. Mehreen?
Honestly, I don't know how much more I can add to what both Ben and Lieke have said, because those are both really fantastic kind of nuanced responses to this question about how art and religion relate to each other. So I think I'll keep my response brief and just say that when we think about, you know, kind of institutional religion, I think that I do think that the two are intertwined. I think that art becomes a visual expression of belief, and obviously religion uses art for that manner as well. And you know, it becomes a way, I think, for people to then relate to what they're being told of in that religious sphere, and it becomes a way for them to you know, more easily absorb what they're being taught. It becomes a method for teaching as well. So it's a very you know, as Ben said at the very beginning, it's a very big question of how arts and religion goes together. But I do think that they are linked in this very, you know, kind of inextricable way, especially when we do look at the, you know, kind of more formal tenets of religion and religious belief.
Thank you. Maybe we can follow up on that. I mean, you've begun to suggest some of the functions that art might serve within religious practice. I wonder if you might want to develop on that a little bit, Ben.
Well, I wanted to pick up on what Lieke was saying about boundaries, and what it raised a question for me about where you can position certain kinds of work or tolerate them, if you're, depending where you come from, you know, maybe for religious reasons or indeed for other reasons, that you may not want religious works in certain, you know, non-religious spaces. But that question of the context is extremely interesting, and the shifting boundaries of what's acceptable where. And I totally take the point that some works that were shocking in their time are now you know, fully incorporatable into spaces of worship when they, you know, they might not have been. But I still think there's an important distinction to be made between works that are maybe made for contemplation over years, potentially centuries, and works that are maybe more like interventions or provocations. And so, and it might be that, you know, a religious institution like the Catholic Church, Lieke mentioned John Paul II, you know, that it might actually want to be involved with both. So, you know, and there was a brief period when the Vatican had a pavilion at the Venice Biennale, this huge art fair, probably the world's kind of biggest showcase for contemporary artists, in which different countries have their pavilions. And the Vatican decided to join that, but only brief. Sadly, it's not currently part of it anymore, but I hope one day it will be. But the kind of works that they commissioned were quite adventurous, and you probably wouldn't put them in a church. So there was a great kind of tabernacle made of pig offal, like a big tent, and it was very beautiful, but, you know, slightly smelly and strange, and you wouldn't probably worship in front of it or in it. It wasn't meant for that, and it wouldn't have lent itself to that. And in any case, it decayed quite quickly. You know, it was already sort of by the end of the summer, it was, you know, it was no longer what it had been, shall we say. So, you know, so that compared with, say, Sherazade Hushiari's beautiful window in St. Martin in the Fields in London, which I hope will be there literally for centuries, which rewards long contemplation by those who worship there, as well as those who visit and sit and look at it for a long period of time. Now, both of those have value. Both of those have been commissioned by institutional churches, religious bodies, but they serve different functions. And I think it's really interesting to think about what contexts permit different sorts of art. And the fact that art that, in the case of the work at the Biennale, which I should say is by a Macedonian artist based in Britain called 𝗟𝗶𝗲𝗲𝗪𝗔, that's a work that sort of ambushes you because you don't expect it. And then you discover what it's made of, and it's even more surprising, and so on. It's a lot of it is about surprise, as well as beauty, surprising beauty. But works that ambush you are also religiously important, because a sort of religious art that only gives you what you already expect and want quickly becomes kitsch. It's just a a reward of your expectations, and that shouldn't be what religious art does. It seems to me it should actually want to take you somewhere else, just as good religion should. It should be transformative, not merely confirming where you already are. So there's a role for these sorts of art, within religion as well as outside it.
Can we be prescriptive about what good religious art should do? You seem to be suggesting we can.
Yes, but there won't be one prescription. So, I think there could be a sort of list of prescriptions, some of which include challenging you or provoking you. That's a meaningful thing to happen in a religious context. And not just meaningful, but a positively, well, it depends on the provocation, I suppose. But, if it's never happening, something's wrong. I'll put it that way around. But so is contemplation. So is the sense of the unifying power of art to bring people together around certain sorts of image. Entire architectural schemes have been created to give the sense that people are being built together through material objects and architecture, built together into a body of people who share things. And that's an incredibly important function. And the list could go on, and maybe we'll come back to some of the other functions it might have. But there are different things you could prescribe, and several of them would be good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, if I can respond.
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, I think the what you just said about that, if it only confirms what you already know, then it might become kitsch. I think that also has to do with, visual arts. It visualizes that which is perhaps unimaginable or ineffable in religious terms. And I think if art has the ability, or an artist created something that has the ability to present you with something that from your frame of reference you would have never come up with yourself, that is so surprising or new, that actually may really give you new insights in how you experience as a believer, how you experience faith, or how you understand a particular religious concept or ritual. And I think that is one of the most interesting and also, almost maybe mysterious functions of art, if an artist is able to do that. But of course, that completely depends on also the frame of reference of the viewer. So I think in that relationship between art and religion that we were talking about before, the spectator or the viewer or the believer, the person engaging with the artwork, I think is crucial as well. And the way how art can invite a person to, or an individual or a collective group maybe, to experience a sense of transcendence, or maybe an outer worldly experience. I think that's really important in thinking about this.
No, certainly, and also the idea for imagery to not remain stagnant. Building off of what you just said, Lieke. So also, you mentioned the 𝗟𝗵𝗲𝗲 show, and her Judith and Holofernes paintings are so incredible, and that's a theme which was consistently repeated. by artists, and then, you know, it has this, you know, I don't want to say a stock image, but when we get to the paintings that she produces, they are shocking, you know, to a wide variety of people. And it's, you know, for the reasons she had, they are more violent. You're showing the woman in a more, you know, kind of potent way than you have before. And that movements of the image, that progression of the image, I think is really, you know, really important, and that can help move how people think about the representations that they're seeing as well.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just say that one of the things I've been really interested in or I've been involved in the last few weeks is thinking about the Raphael cartoons that are in the Victorian Albert Museum. They've just been, well, they would have opened in November if it hadn't been for the lockdown, but these are enormous works called cartoons. They were the designs Raphael made for a series of tapestries, 10 tapestries for the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And the cartoons have become, you know, some of the great treasures of English collections. You know, and they're actually part of the Queen's own collection, but they're displayed in a special room dedicated to them at the V&A. And they tell the stories, key episodes from the stories of Peter and Paul. What's interesting about them is that they, you know, they were the product of, as to go back to your question, Danielle, of a really specific, quite prescriptive commission. So, you know, Pope Leo X wanted these images to reinforce an image of papal authority deriving from the first two great apostles martyred in Rome, Peter and Paul. So they had a kind of incredibly prescriptive commission attached to them. But what happens with all works of art is they float free of the intentions of the patron or indeed of the artist, and they start to behave differently and do different things because of the new audiences and the new contexts. So when they're in the V&A, well, there's a history before that. You know, then Henry VIII wants a full set for himself, but he's the king who breaks away from the Pope. He breaks away from Rome. So he has he's finding a different set of meanings in them. Who knows exactly what, but you know, that's interesting. Charles I also has his own set made, and then suddenly they're in a museum, and the big thing they have to say to V&A visitors is that they are playing a part in the story of art, and they're used by budding artists to come and kind of practice on, to learn from Raphael, to sit at the feet of Raphael and learn. And whether they're about Peter and Paul isn't really that important at all. It's the fact that they're by Raphael. And that means that you can ask a question now, as they reopen in 2020 or sadly 2021 now, what else can they mean? Because if they've meant these different things to these different people in different contexts through history, what else can they mean? And it might be that you come back to finding some of the religious meanings of them really interesting, without suddenly sort of signing up for the original kind of full papal narrative that went with their commission. Mm-hmm. But you know, they mean more than any of those one things. And I think that's really interesting when we think about any work of art.
And I think that's the great thing, if these artworks are maybe even temporary, but still, if they become part of the public domain at some point, because then these different meanings can also be brought into conversation with one another. I experienced that with a new podcast that I'm part of, which is about Bible stories, and every episode there's a Bible story that's central, and then there are different artistic disciplines that have responded to this Bible story that are discussed. So there's music, literature, visual arts, and film. And every episode, there's also a theologian part of it. And I know these Bible stories because I know the artworks predominantly. The theologian knows these Bible stories because he reads about them in the Bible and he preaches them. And we actually came, after recording some episodes, we came to the conclusion that we actually learned so much also from each other because of all these different perspectives that we have going into the story and the different artworks. And I think that's would also be great if the V&A or any other venue could achieve that in bringing these different perspectives together, and that there's, you know, there's always something to learn for everyone, but that the richness of these artworks also come to the fore.
Thanks, Lieke. I'd like to come back to you, Mehreen, and perhaps think about how we know if an artwork is religious. Is it always obvious?
No, I don't think it is. And I actually have some images that I wanted to share with people. So if I could have my first slide, please. So on the question of is art always religious? So I think that in a very dogmatic sense, to say that art is religious, I think that it has to be created in some way for worship, for an act of worship. But I do think it's a very gray area. And I wanted to use these two images to highlight that. So on the left-hand side of the screen is an image of the Süleymaniyye Mosque in Istanbul. It's one of the great Ottoman mosques. It's a space that was built, for worship, so built for a religious function. All the accoutrements that go inside of it, all the decoration inside of it, it's all part of this wider, construct to aid in worship. So, taking a very broad definition of what art is to include, architecture and material culture, you can have productions which are very much, created for religious reasons. But then if you look at the image on the right of the screen, which is a painting from 16th century Iran, which depicts the Prophet Muhammad's ascent to heaven during his miraculous night journey. We see the Prophet Muhammad on his steed Buraq. He's flying through the air. He's surrounded by angels. There's this incredible, flaming halo around his head. It's a scene depicting an event, a mystical event, miraculous event of his life. It evokes a sense of wonder and a sense of mysticism. You can't help but kind of contemplate as you look at it, but it was made for inclusion within a book of poetry. It was not made for a religious reason. It was not made for a religious text. And so for an item like that, can we define it as religious, as an artwork? And I think this is where we do get into a gray area, because something like that could indeed, invite religious contemplation. But I think then we're entering into a scenario where it's very much on the part of the viewer, what they are actually seeing and perceiving when they are looking at an object, if they perceive it as religious or if they just perceive it as a thing of beauty in this particular context. So it very much is the case of what a viewer reads into an image when they're looking at it. So to say that we can define art as being religious, I think can be quite tricky at times, actually.
Can I come in there? I think that's really interesting, because in a way that this presses for a distinction between the content of a work and then the very the process of making art at all. And this picks up on one of Lieke's points early on about creativity and creation, that, in a sense that the content of a work might be one of the things that determines whether we think of it as religious. Although, as you're saying, Mehreen, even something that has clearly a religious subject matter may not be made for devotional purposes, as that illumination isn't. But even if it were not an image of the Prophet or any religious figure or episode, there's also a sense in which the fact of making things at all and seeking to communicate through made objects and seeking to share them with each other is religiously interesting. So the fact we communicate, I mean, you can say all the same things, I suppose, about language, but visual art as a very distinctive kind of language is religiously interesting. because we seek to convey things to each other through it, and we build community through it. We make connections with each other through it, and we gesture through it towards things that we care about. And to say that isn't religious, even if it's fun, or even if it's a comic book, or we're still exploring what we care about and desire and fear and all of those things, and these are all religiously important, or potentially religiously important. So it's as hard to say that anything isn't religious, if you like, as it is to definitely say that something is.
Yeah, and it brings us then back to the question of what, how do we define religious, how do we define an object as being religious? And I was just thinking as well also of, for when we're all able to travel again, and going to places like, India, Southeast Asia, these places that have this grand, temple tradition. These are structures which are plastered with images of the gods, sculptural forms, painted forms, and specifically thinking of the sculptural, imagery. These are not just representations of the deity, but when they're being used in a religious sense, they are the deity, like the deity is there within the sculpture. And contrast that with then, images of these same figures which are made for a tourist market. It's the same image, but it has a completely different purpose in its making, depending for, obviously the audience it's intended for, as opposed to the audience within, the temple space. So it's a it's a really interesting question of how religion comes into the, the production of items or objects or images.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think it's Ben, in response to what you said, I think all art or all creative work can be interesting from the perspective of a scholar of religion, but then there's also, on the other hand, the sort of the intentions or the reasons why people make things or why artists make their work. And to come back to the Biennale pavilion of the Vatican, a lot of there are two things that are interesting about that. What you said about the artworks there not necessarily being proper for worship or for sacred sites. That was also one of the really that was strongly emphasized also in the catalog and by the people who organized it, that the art that was made was specifically made for the secular side of the Biennale, and definitely not sacred art, because that was a wholly other category. And I think that distinction also really played through in the artists. Some of the artists were really strong about their artistic freedom that they had maintained in contributing to the pavilion. And of course, it was a commission from the Vatican, but they were really really emphasizing, well, I'm not religious, or I'm not restricted by any of the terms that were set by the commissioner. And I think there's a really interesting tension there, that artworks that can be really interesting from the perspective of scholars, but then the people who make it or the people who interact with it might be very sort of strongly against that notion of religion or religious or their affiliation with religion. And I think that's really interesting in calling art religious. That role of or these different perceptions are really interesting. So maybe there's not there we come back to it again, there's not one definitive answer to this question either, because the whole notion of religion is so contested.
I mean, just to come in again on that, I think the interesting thing about the particular work I referred to, which was called 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗏, the made of offal, was that it actually, that distinction, even if the Vatican wanted to make it, and even if the artists wanted to make it, between, you know, that religious art is wholly other from Biennale art, it actually broke down. It didn't work neatly because, for a start, the brief given to the artists was a text of scripture. So it was the opening chapter of St. John's Gospel. The word became flesh. So that's partly why she made it out of flesh. So that was interesting. So it was already a kind of response to a scriptural text. She made it, she was partly inspired by the extraordinary Ghent altarpiece, and especially the central image of the mystic lamb on an altar. And so her structure, which was quite kind of quadrantal, if that's a word, based around a sort of quadrant, was partly derived from an altarpiece, an incredibly famous altarpiece, and the space, because it was a canopied space, felt like a tabernacle. And so some people actually responded to it as they were inside it, in some of the same bodily ways they might if they had entered a place of worship. So in a way, the distinction deconstructed itself, and I thought that was fascinating. And it reminds me of another very similar experience, which was back in 2016, when my then colleague Aaron Rosen, who you know, Lieke, who's now in the States, curated something he called Stations 2016, based around the traditional Christian Stations of the Cross, so Christ's journey to be crucified, which has been a traditional kind of Christian devotion. But the 14 stations that he created were all over London, and some of them were in art galleries, and some of them were works of art in public spaces like Parliament Square, and some were specially commissioned contemporary works, again, sometimes outside and sometimes inside. And so if you wanted to follow them, you had to move all over the city. But what was so interesting was that you could be doing it as somebody who was pursuing it as a devotional exercise, praying in front of each of them. You could be visiting it as an exhibition. In doing either, you moved in and out of secular and sacred spaces. So sometimes you were in churches to see the works, and sometimes you were outdoors, and sometimes you were in galleries. And even more weirdly, the most obviously religious works amongst the 14 were in the galleries, and the most contemporary works, which wouldn't have necessarily looked at all religious, were in the churches. So everything kind of broke down. And I think that new permeability between the sacred and the secular is really interesting, and shows that making these neat distinctions doesn't work always.
Just a quick note to our audience, a quick reminder that you can put questions in the Q&A box or on Facebook or Twitter, and I will take some of those questions towards the end, so do put them in there. Mehreen, I'd like to come back to you, and perhaps we could start thinking about the role of art in religious practice in particular.
Okay, so I'm going to kind of focus this from my perspective on art in the Islamic sense. And so can I have the second slide, please? Thank you. So when we're talking about the role of arts within the religious practice of Islam, again, giving quite a broad definition to arts, I think that it has a really important part to play. The Prophet Muhammad is supposed to have said that God is beautiful and loves beauty. And so there is then this idea that when items are being created for religious, for worship and for devotion, that the more beautiful they are, the more, well, the better it is. And so when we're talking about, kind of architectural space, the space for devotion, we then have parts of, mosques or parts of structures which are inherently, beautiful in their creation, and then others which are given more of an enhanced aesthetic quality to them. And so just an example of some of these spaces, the top left picture that you see on this slide is the 𝗏𝗲𝗵𝗶𝗱 Masjid in Lahore. So this is the great congregational mosque that was built by the Mughal Emperor Alamgir. there. And what we're seeing in this picture is the prayer hall and part of the courtyard. So it allows for the functional use of the space. It allows for the gathering of the Muslim community in order for them to carry out their acts of worship there. Within a mosque, you will have a mihrab or multiple mihrabs, which is a niche in the wall, signifying the direction Muslims are supposed to face when they pray, because wherever you are in the world, Muslims are supposed to face towards Mecca. And the mihrab and the mihrab space tends to be the most, kind of elaborately decorated part of a mosque. And on the bottom left image there is a mihrab from the Ilkhanid period in Iran, commissioned by the ruler 𝗟𝗲𝗀𝗃. And it's hard to tell from this image, but it's elaborately beautiful. It's decorated in stucco, carved stucco, with these really fantastic geometric and floral motifs and calligraphy. It's a proper, work of art in and of itself. And it was made for the winter prayer hall of the Friday Mosque in Isfahan. So it's just one example of this elaboration of aesthetic and of beauty in that particular artistic site. In congregational mosques, you'll tend to also have the inclusion of minbars, which are the pulpits, and you see an example of that on the bottom right of the screen. And this, this is an Ottoman example, and the Ottoman examples tend to be quite architectural. So a lot of craftsmanship goes into their, production. It looks like a miniature building in some ways, and very elaborately carved, very beautifully carved as well. And then can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And then you have items which are created for, personal worship and personal devotion. And here you see again this enhancement of the aesthetic quality of these items. And I should put a caveat here that these are all items created for an elite, patron, but across the board, when items like this are made for worship, for people from all backgrounds and different classes of societies and different, classes of wealth, you still have an enhancement, an aesthetic enhancement to these items. So looking at items for personal use, for devotion, the Quran, obviously, the holy book of Islam, and on the left, the top left is this fantastic Mamluk Quran, which was made for the Sultan Baybars, and its opening, the opening that you see here, are the opening illuminated pages. And it's, if we come back to that idea that, God is beautiful and loves beauty, we're seeing this enhancement of, in this example, the word of God is being aesthetically enhanced in this particular example through not only the elaborate calligraphy, which there's several styles evident on these two pages, but also the luxurious materials which are being used. Gold leaf and liquid gold has been employed. Lapis lazuli is the base for the blue paint, so really expensive materials and luxurious materials. The paper is of very high quality and has been burnished, so it has a real sheen to it. So the whole book in and of itself is a luxury production, but very, very much for a religious purpose. On the right side of the screen is an example of a prayer mat. So, Muslims tend to have these prayer mats that they pray on, and they can be made of material like this one, which is cotton, and it has silk on it, or it can be, you see velvet ones, all sorts of different materials used, but they in and of themselves are then enhanced as well to portray, the kind of beauty of the art object. And then something as simple as the prayer beads, the tasbihs, can be made from really, very basic materials to something like this, which is using a much more finer material. This one is made of mother of pearl. And so we're seeing this enhancement of the, the religious art in this instance in order to create that well, the actual practicing of the religion is incorporating all these different objects and spaces and elements. So we see, you know, that they're beautiful objects, but these are actually functional in and of themselves. So I think we can say then that art in this instance is very much projecting and being used in that religious sense.
It's very interesting how so much beauty, as you say, and so much detail and so many luxurious materials are used, but at the same time in service of a certain kind of desire to withhold, not to exactly to withhold, but not to make you mistake them for the object that you're meant to be directing your intentions towards. So
if anything, they're meant to help enhance that, you know, that spiritual devotion.
Right.
So for example, the prayer mat, the design on that, you know, you can relate it to the design of a mosque. It had a very architectural frame to it. And then in the center, there was the arch of the mihrab. And then the other prominent feature of that design was, you know, imagery relating to the gardens of paradise. So the cypress trees and the floral motifs. So yeah, exactly that. These are beautiful objects in and of themselves, but they are meant to, you know, kind of channel the devotional act which is being undertaken.
And if you rest with them, you've made a mistake in some way, because, you know, they're the God who it is not possible to render visually is precisely their true object. So they're hypervisual, but in being hypervisual, they're trying to take you beyond the visual, you know, to the worship of the unvisualizable. And I find that really fascinating. So the niche is an empty space, but it's fabulously dense with visual, you know, with visual decoration. But
yeah, exactly. No, it's a great way of putting it.
Yeah.
It was interesting also to see where those objects are now. So your references, it was one of them was in the V&A, one of them is in the British Museum. I mean, how does that affect our experiencing of them?
I mean, if you were to see them in the museums now and not know their functional purpose, you're looking at an object and you're admiring it for its aesthetic quality, which, you know, these are magnificent objects. Like I said, I was just showing items of elite patronage, but they then obviously lose the importance of the functional purpose for which they were made if you're not aware of that. So you're seeing them as these beautiful aesthetic pieces, but unless you are then given that functional context within the museum space, you won't know.
Yeah, and I think that's
maybe you can jump in here.
Well, yeah, I think that's one of the main challenges, also for the museum where I'm working in, but I'm sure also for the museums where these objects that you discussed are in now, because there are so many different ways of approaching these objects. There's the aesthetics, there's the history and the historical context in which they were made and in which they have functioned, and there's their theological or spiritual significance. And I think these three ideally should always be in balance with one another. But then if I also think about the museum where I work, it's really a fine line if you want to sort of convey that spiritual significance or that function that they have, how to do that, how to put that on display. I remember we once talked about an exhibition or a theme of how to show objects that are that people pray with. And so, for instance, the prayer mat. But how do you put that on display? How do you convey what people experience while they're using these objects and while they're praying? And one of the questions that also came to the fore is then, so should we then also have a room where people can pray? Just as a sort of a hypothetical question, is that, because if prayer is the topic, then is that is that seems to be sort of a logical part of it, to actually have the activity there as well. But that also means that you put people who, if people would like to use that room, you put these people on display while they're praying. So it's there needs to be something sort of in between that, having the people actually do perform the practice, and having the object as merely an aesthetic object. And I think that is always sort of a field of negotiation. And I think ideally in a museum context, you take visitors along in that decision process. So if there's a reason why you only can or want to focus on aesthetics, I think you still need to make people aware of that which you are not touching upon for whatever reason. Maybe it's just purely practical, or maybe there's not enough knowledge about it, or
well, and I think also there's also the other the other elements, which is when we're talking about these objects, we're seeing them for what they are and for what they were used for and being made for these purposes. But I think it's also really important to think of the people who are making them and the process through which they're made, because these don't just come about as fully formed creations. And so then you get into really interesting questions about how the items were made, who was making them, who are they being made for. And again, if we think of the prayer mat, the process behind that is incredibly complicated. There are multiple different ways of dyeing which went into the creation of that one object. And like with the Quran, you have not only the illuminator making the designs, but then the calligrapher, you have the paper maker, you have the binder. So we see these, again, we're seeing these as isolated objects, but there's so much which goes into their production. And when we add that layer of religious importance to them, I never want to see the artisans and the craftsmen kind of taken out of the equation, but in some cases it's kind of inevitable depending on what the focus of the object being there is.
That's true. And if there is a way of including these people who are involved in making them, I think you also emphasize that it's it's a living practice. And it's an object that belongs to a tradition that's not only from the past, but it's still very much alive today. And Absolutely. I think that's also really important in thinking about how to curate religious art or religious heritage in general, of how to, I think, continuously create a connection between these historical objects or older objects from a religious past to the present. And maybe, well, for sure, the religious present looks completely different than it did in the Middle Ages or the modern time. But I think the present and the past can really inform each other. And if you, for instance, really only have these objects presented in sort of a chronological way or in a particular time frame and look at their aesthetics, you're kind of denying the fact that there once was spiritual significance attributed to these objects, and people still do that today in a similar manner, maybe to similar objects or different ones, but it's alive. And I think that's something that a museum can do, but it's a challenge as well, and it's easily forgotten, because it's often much easier to think about, okay, chronology, what happened first, what happened then, and who made it, and what is special about it. But to really sort of make that connection between the past and present, I think really also enlivens the displays, the collection displays for visitors as well, and you really sort of invite them to engage with that as well.
Lieke, do you perhaps want to speak to the exhibition that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I'm currently working on an exhibition about the biblical figure of Mary Magdalene, which will open in February 21. And in that exhibition, we actually really made a very conscious choice to present historical art and contemporary art in a sort of a trans-historical way. So it's all sort of mingled together. That's really to, yeah, what I just said, to reinforce the fact that Mary Magdalene is not a figure that was only looked at or dealt with in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance, but still her place in the collective imagination is still very prominent today. And yeah, that's something we really want to reinforce, and as well as her multiplicity. She's a figure that has many faces and is interpreted in many different ways throughout history. And I think it's really important to show all these faces in addition to one another, how they emerged, and how I think what's really interesting about her is that, or her persona, is that the development of all these different faces, the old images have not been replaced by the new. So the image of the first witness to the resurrection, the fallen woman, the hermit living in the cave in south of France, the religious, how do I say, the beloved disciple of Jesus, all these, potentially the wife of Christ, all these faces exist next to each other. And that's also something we really wanted to, or we're really going to emphasize in the exhibition, that there's not sort of one definitive answer to who was Mary Magdalene, to that question, but that multiplicity is actually what makes her so interesting, and also what still inspires artists today. So we really have some great combinations of older artworks and newer ones, which really show that.
Thank you. One of the impossible questions with which I opened the session was about interfaith dialogue and whether art might be able to stimulate that in some way. Ben, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I think it can. In fact, a practice I've been involved with for a long time is something called scriptural reasoning, where people from different religious traditions sit down together and look at their sacred texts in a conversational mode. And in recent months, actually, I've begun to think that the format of that is both deeply religious, because many religious traditions have modes of collective scriptural study within their own traditions. In Judaism, for example, Chevruta study is where two people will sit, often two, sometimes more, but will sit and really kind of argue over what a text means, not because there's an arrival point where you determine its meaning and then that's it. It's because the discussion itself is the point. I mean, that is the good product of the conversation, is that there is a conversation. So our tendency to want to arrive at kind of final meanings is denied in these more open conversational modes of engagement. And it's also a feature of ancient Greek and Roman civilization, the idea of the symposium, where people will sit around and multiple voices will interact about a shared topic of interest. And again, the way these were recorded by people like Plato was not as were decisions made by a meeting, but precisely the conversation was what was recorded. So what's transmitted down the centuries are dialogues, not as just a series of steps towards a decision or a final statement. Now, scriptural reasoning has that quality, but across religious boundaries, so not just within them. And I think you can do that with the visual art of different religious traditions. So you can, as it were, one of the things I notice about the way people often talk about art is there's less of a sense of pressure to come up with an answer, because art isn't the kind of thing you have an answer to. It's something you talk about. So the conversation is partly what art generates, and you know you're doing it right because the conversation is lively. And part of what you want to then sort of bring other people into is the conversation, not to say, Caravaggio's painting means this. Just go away and remember that, and you don't even have to look at the painting ever again. It's quite the opposite of that. So perhaps, you know, just as much as sacred texts, and maybe even more, works of art can become sites, locations of conversation across traditions, and with a sort of freedom that gets opened up by the fact that you don't have to arrive at an answer. So I really do think that it's a place of meeting, if you like, for different religious groups.
No, I completely agree with that. And if you all can indulge me one more, I actually have a fantastic visual representation of this. If I can have the last slide, please. The next, yeah. This one, please, thank you. So if you look at the top left painting, that is a Mughal painting, so done at the Mughal courts in South Asia, most likely in Lahore, commissioned by the Mughal emperor of a very Christian scene. It's the descent from the cross. We see Christ being taken down by three people. The Virgin Mary has collapsed at the foot of the cross. Angels are hovering above in the air, and there are assorted other people, including Mary Magdalene, you know, around the ground as well. And this is a copy of a European print that was at the Mughal courts, because the Mughal Emperor Akbar had invited Jesuit priests to his court to actually be a part of interfaith dialogues that he was having take place between himself, these Jesuit priests, Hindu Brahmins, you know, Sufi mystics. So we have these, you know, events which would take place where, you know, religion was being discussed, and then we have the visual, you know, kind of production which went along with that, where the interest is in the image. And I mean, I have to say as well that, you know, in Islam, Christ is a prophet as well. So he is of religious importance, but when these kind of works are being made, it's for the interest in the image and the story more than anything else. So art absolutely, you know, works as a point of discussion and of meeting of the religions, both in very positive ways and, unfortunately, you know, in kind of contemporary society in very negative ways as well, I have to say. But it is absolutely a point of dialogue and hopefully more for the good than ill.
I'm aware of the time, so I would like to take some questions if we can. So I think we had one about the idea that making itself is a spiritual or religious practice. Would anyone like to speak to that?
Sorry, can you clarify the question?
Yeah, so the idea, what would you say about the idea of making, the act of making itself as a spiritual or religious practice?
I'm not an artist myself, so I'd be hesitant to speak as though I were one. But I do know from friends who are artists that that their processes of making can take on for them a quality of I don't quite know how to put it, you know, you know, almost transcendental experience. So by that I mean the sense that something is happening through them and not only something that they control, and so that they're sort of becoming a channel or a conduit for something that itself is seeking to be made through their skill. And that, I find that very interesting. I think lots of different academic disciplines would want to give different accounts of what that is. You know, neuroscientists have something to say about nearly everything these days, and you know, and no doubt psychologists and all sorts of other people would. but I do think that's something very interesting, that often agency gets suspended, one's sense of control over one's own agency gets suspended when making something.
Thanks, Ben. There's actually a really interesting follow-up question, which I think links up quite well, about authorship. So the question of authorship looms large in contemporary art. In contrast, it seems that historically authorship was minimized through intentional anonymity, extensive collaboration, etc. Does the emphasis put upon authorship in contemporary art preclude our ability to see an artwork as religious in the same way that historical peoples may have done?
Does someone else want to go at that one?
I mean, Lieke, you might be better placed to answer, especially with your exhibition coming up, but I don't know that it would. I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, like Rothko's Stations of the Cross, for example. I mean, like somebody who is as famous as that and whose works are as famous as they are, but still, you know, they were created with that intention in mind. They're you know, they were placed in a chapel. I think then that spiritual importance that can be attached to them, I don't think it diminishes just because then we equate the work with an artist as well.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a danger in seeing artists themselves as iconic or as genius, which we've done for a long time. And actually, this week, I think there was an interview with the director of the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, one of the most important contemporary art museums in the Netherlands, and they have on their I think on the facade of the museum, it says "Meet the icons," and he said something like, "Okay, that's history. We have to get rid of being in awe or how you say that, idolizing the artists themselves. It has to be about the histories that we can tell with them, about the context. It has to be, you know, it's no longer about the canon. So I think there's actually a shift in going on or going to happen. I guess the MoMA rearrangement is also a good example of that. We, yeah, in the art world, that focus on the individual artist, and no matter what they made, just anything they touched is amazing. That conviction is kind of disappearing a little bit, and I think that's a good thing. But still, yeah, I fully agree with Mehreen what you said about how even those big names that we've looked at for so long as icons, they still can have made artworks that are fully intended, or maybe not intended, but experienced as religious as well.
Thanks. Let's take another question. So with built forms and public displays of religious practice, are there any signs of the impact of climate change in terms of access and conservation?
Oh, wow. That's a huge question.
Any takers?
I'm going to say yes and leave it at that.
Okay.
No, honestly, I don't mean to be flippant, but it is. It's a very, very large question, and I say yes because I feel like I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but I would imagine that, yeah, absolutely, there is going to be, if not already, there will be problems around built space and urbanization and places which are used for worship, and I think we will, you know, see an impact on those at some point, if we're not already seeing them now. Like I said, I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I would assume so.
Thanks. Let's take one more. So where does didactic art fit into this conversation? Can art which was made to convey a specific message or story be good art?
I think it's very hard to find art that actually really ever does that, even if the reason it was commissioned was to do that. In most cases, the very making of a work of art creates a multivalency, a sort of possibility, a set of possibilities that, to go back to something I said earlier, the artist, and even the artist, can't control, let alone the patron. So, you know, the church, just to speak about the Christian tradition, the church has a long history of wanting works of art to do very precise things, and they hardly ever do. Even if you chuck them out and say that that's not fulfilling the purpose we asked you to fulfill. And that it is partly because, as we've said, visual imagery is not a set of propositions on a page, and so it will behave in ways that take its different audiences, different sets of viewers, in all kinds of unpredictable directions, and that's part of what's so wonderful about it. So I would even question whether there is a purely didactic art. However, there are some forms of art that try to be, and I think to that I would say that the art of indicative statements or even imperatives is less interesting on the whole than the art that asks questions, the interrogative kind of forms of art, the kind of art that explores desire, and the kind of art that conjectures alternative possibilities. And that sense of, you know, art being a window onto questions, conjectures, and desires is likely to be the art that people keep coming back to, rather than the art that just wants to deliver a message.
Thank you. We've got 2 minutes left, so I want to squeeze in one last question. So art and religion both require community if they are to be appreciated or if one is to practice. But in the age of TV, streaming, media channels, etc., we're losing a sense of community. And if Europe, the US, the UK, etc., is becoming more secular, what does this mean for art and religion? Is fragmentation or this loss a threat or a chance to respond or reinvent itself?
Yeah, if I can respond to that, I think it's definitely true that times are much more individualized and focused on the individual than before. But that doesn't mean that artists or individuals are not engaged with religion. So it may be in a completely different way. But still there is, through art, I think, the possibility to, even on your very own, to feel part of something that goes beyond yourself. And whether that's, you know, a religious tradition that you are a part of or that you know of, or if it's, maybe a sense of art history that you can place a particular artwork in a larger tradition. But I think that sense of feeling part of something that's bigger than yourself is still there. And I also think
that's a really positive note for us to finish on. Okay. Sorry, we are out of time. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks to our speakers. I hope you have a lovely break, and we'll see you after Christmas for our next round of Forum for Philosophy events.